Hey everybody, Quantum here, and in this video I wanted to attempt to make a tier list for URSULA'S Returns meta ahead of the LORCANA challenge happening in Chicago over this weekend, June 8th and June 9th. So I am posting this on Friday, June the 7th. So let's go ahead and jump straight in. I wanted to start with a spicy pick, something that you may not see coming, similar to what happened in Atlanta with Amber Amethyst taking the whole tournament. And I think one of the unexplored, underrated ink pairings of this format is actually Sapphire Emerald. In theory, this ink pairing can do a lot to do damage into the meta because it can mitigate a lot of the strength and steel based removal that we're seeing dominate the metagame right now. Essentially, what this ink pairing will maybe try to do is use the Bucky and Diablo engine, as we know that that's a very strong combination of cards right there, in order to force discards and draw cards, but also complement both of those cards in the Sapphire, Cogsworth, and Aurora Dreaming Guardian, being able to grant resist to both the Bucky and the Diablo, making the Diablo more resilient and not being able to be outed directly by like a Baboom or a Let the Storm Rage On, which we know is very popular on the steel side. But the Aurora also granting ward to the Diablo will make it so that you can't target it, or your opponent can't target it, with things like Brawl, Madame Medusa, so on and so forth, protecting it from those kinds of targeting removals, as we've seen things like Be Prepared not really be played as widely as they were before, meaning if you can't target things directly, you'll have a harder time removing them. Now that being said, you could say that, let's say, the new Sisu, the thing that wipes out 2 strength and lower characters, would be a good counterplay against this deck, and you would be right. But on the Emerald side, we also have the new location in the Hidden Cove, which when you move your Cogsworth and your Diablo there, will give it +1 strength as well as +1 toughness. But the +1 strength will make it so that they are no longer susceptible to that Sisu. So depending on the matchup, this deck or this in combination could have very unique interactions. Again, you don't need to see every single little combo piece, but again, depending on the matchup, you could fish for and try to set up different combinations of cards to protect against what your opponent is trying to do. So this is a decent anti-meta pick potentially. It does have additional draw power in a Hiram engine, so you have Hiram and Diablo potentially drawing you a ton of cards. You do have some removal based options because you can play things like the new big Hades, since you can play something like the Hidden Incaster, which is an item that makes your uninkables inkable but also can be banished with Hiram to draw cards. And you can also play something like Under the Sea in order to do a lower to the ground board wipe, mitigating some aggro threats as well. So in theory, could be a decent deck. Obviously, no one's really been testing it, so we don't know. But if this deck does pop up in Chicago, just know we called it here first. Next up, I wanted to take a look at Ruby Amber as a solid A tier pick in my opinion. There's a number of different ways I think you can build this deck now to be very effective in URSULA'S Returns metagame. Obviously, we know traditionally that this build has been utilizing Mufasa to great effect, and on the play, this deck is extremely strong, but where it suffered usually was on the draw because it is a tempo-focused deck. However, if you watch my channel, for example, you know that you can utilize some of the unique combinations of things like the new Aerial Singer 7 with Be Prepared in order to wipe board, still have all your ink available in order to develop a decent sized board afterwards and regain tempo and control the match from there. This deck can do well into most of the metagame since it's fairly consistent. It has a good card draw engine with the Amber cards, things like Rapunzel and Surfer's Stitch, and of course it has access to all the Ruby based strength oriented removal, things like Brawl, the Sisus, obviously like Be Prepared and Madame Medusa. So I do think that this is a very strong deck. It doesn't really have any inherent weaknesses. I think against Emerald Steel discard, it could technically have a little bit of trouble on the draw still, but for the most part into the control matchups and other mid-range matchups, I think this deck could actually do fairly well. In my opinion, your best bet at an aggro deck for performing in this format is still going to be Emerald Amethyst. While the overall power level of this deck I think dropped a little bit with URSULA'S Return, I do think it's still a fairly effective option. However, it's not nearly as good into the Ruby decks as it used to be, thanks to the introduction of things like Brawl and the Sisu packages that we see Ruby running nowadays. You still have a good matchup into Ruby Amethyst and Sapphire Ruby, but they're just not as strong as they used to be. The tools that you got in this deck in the forms of like the new Diablo do give you an additional card draw engine, which is always very powerful, but I just think you still have a hard time into some of the meta decks, mainly the Ruby decks that you would normally dominate in the previous metagame. Also, given that Emerald Steel is potentially a huge force in the metagame. That is also an ink pairing that will give you some trouble as an Amethyst Emerald aggro player. One of the strongest decks in LORCANA's history has definitely been Amber Steel Song, and traditionally this deck has always had a solidified spot in the S tier ranking of the game. For the first time ever, I do think we see a dramatic fall off of Amber Steel Song though, given the relative power levels of Sapphire decks in this format from the boosts that they got in Ursula's Return. I do think that people will gravitate away from Amber Steel Song because of its inherent bad matchups with those Sapphire decks, despite it being able to overcome them and have good matchups into Emerald decks, which we know are going to be popular in this format. I think a lot of players will just not want to deal with the stress of the really bad matchup into Sapphire Ruby and the relatively bad matchup into Sapphire Steel. Again, fundamentally this deck still remains very strong, but it didn't get any real new additional tools that help it combat some of its worst matchups, whereas Ruby Sapphire really got a lot of very powerful tools that make it much more playable and therefore more likely to be represented in the metagame. So still a solid A tier I think, but probably not going to be too represented in this metagame with Sapphire running as rampant as it is. Not exactly sure why I decided to rate Amethyst Sapphire here, but I do think that some people may attempt to try this deck because of its very strong draw engines and being able to flood the board. However, I do think that relative to the other decks in the format, this ink pairing just doesn't do enough in order to keep pace with some of the stronger removal options that Ruby decks and Steel based decks still have. Therefore, I'm going to put this into the D tier. Ruby Amethyst remains a solid, consistent option to choose in Ursula's Returns metagame, and I'm going to put this into the A tier simply because this deck is a tempo-oriented mid-range deck now, and it's still, like I said, very good into most matchups. It doesn't necessarily have anything that it hard loses to. It does have its struggles against Emerald still, despite it getting some strength-based removal on the Ruby side and things to mitigate aggro strategies like the new Flynn Rider and Sisu combination. However, this deck does lack some of the explosive power that the Sapphire decks have with things like the Lucky Dime, Aerials, and Tamatoas, and Emerald Steel can technically still give this deck a lot of trouble. Now, good Ruby Amethyst pilots will be able to navigate through a lot of those more slightly negative matchups, and because you don't necessarily have anything you really lose hard against anymore, this deck, like I said, remains a solid A tier because of its fundamentals and its ability to play very nicely on curve in order to tempo its way into a win. I think the Amber Amethyst ink pairing remains a solid C tier deck. And you can look at this in two ways. One is the hyper aggro deck that has really persisted since set 1. I don't think that deck does a lot into the heavy removal based meta we're in, where things like Brawl, the Sisus, Madame Medusas, etc. absolutely destroy and disrupt the aggro strategy. And when you look at the deck that won Atlanta, if you try to adapt that for set 4, it doesn't really work too well, since Perdita is very susceptible to that Ruby removal now, whereas this deck and this ink pairing had favorable matchups into Ruby Amethyst. It really doesn't anymore if the Ruby Amethyst player is running things like those Flynn Riders, the Brawls, etc. that really offset the advantages that you attempt to gain with Perdita. So a solid C tier for Amber Amethyst. Next up, we're taking a look at Amethyst Steel, and for me, this is a decent B range deck. I don't think that this deck is going to be represented at all really in Chicago. While the Jafar version is probably your best bet at making this deck work now, the super aggro version and the mid-range version definitely have fallen off a little bit. This ink pairing really didn't get too much support from Ursula's Return. No matter how you try to construct this deck, it just seems like the cards released in the first 3 sets just pair better with this ink pairing. Therefore, as other decks got stronger, this deck kind of stagnated, and we knew from previous sets that this deck wasn't really a force in those metagames, so there's no real reason to believe that it's going to explode onto the scene and do something significant in Chicago or in the Ursula's Return metagame as of right now. One of the best ink pairings in Ursula's Return, in my opinion, is Sapphire Steel. This is a deck that should have no real terrible matchups. It can definitely have some matchups where it may be slightly not favored, but even the current ranking that I have on screen here, I would favor Sapphire Steel into every single one of these decks right now. It is a deck that is able to play a low number of uninkables. It's able to be very consistent with a lot of card draw options in terms of its Forty Spheres and Popsicles, its Hiram engine, its Beast Tragic Hero, its Whole New World, its Tamatoa recycling of those 40 Spheres and Popsicles potentially. Like, you have a lot of options in how you want to build this deck out. You can even run Maurice's Workshop. There's a lot of techable options to make this deck very resilient and combat a lot of the strategies currently in the metagame. It also has a very favorable matchup into Emerald Steel, in my opinion. One of the few decks, if not the only real deck in the metagame that has that right now. And it's able to even combat the Ruby Sapphire deck because it plays the new Aerial, which means that the Ruby Sapphire player cannot ice block it down, cannot Medusa it, cannot Sisu empowered sibling board wipe it, and because of the lack of Be Prepareds now in the format, this is a deck that really benefits from going a little bit wider, where those Cogsworth traditionally would have struggle into the Ruby decks. They are a lot more resilient now without Be Prepareds being played in high numbers in the Ruby decks. So I do think that Sapphire Steel is a deck that, when piloted correctly and constructed correctly, can definitely take down the tournament. However, I don't think it will, because I think people aren't necessarily ready to play it in that level, but it wouldn't surprise me to see this deck making it very far in the Chicago Challenge on day 2. Looking at another rogue option, we have Ruby Emerald, and this is an ink pairing that I think caught the best support in both colors individually, but combined together, I do think that this is still a C-rated deck. I think there are a couple of ways to explore this ink pairing. Obviously, the one that comes to mind is using the evasive packages that both of these ink colors offer. However, that being said, against other Ruby decks and against the Steel decks in the format, this is an ink pairing that just falls down flat on its face, because all of its low strength evasive characters definitely will just struggle into that removal, and with the lack of inherent card advantage aside from Diablo and maybe a few other random Ruby cards like maybe the Queen of Hearts and stuff, it can be very hard to maintain the same level of advantage other decks have. Again, somebody might be able to cook up an interesting list that maybe doesn't focus on that evasive strategy, but right now I just don't see this making a splash in the Chicago metagame. It seems like it's too much of a risk to play to try to do well. If you watched my videos in the past, you might be surprised to see me put Emerald Steel into A tier and not S tier. And the reason I'm doing that is because in a tournament setting, it is a bit of a risk to run Emerald Steel. While it is still a very powerful deck, you do have the vulnerability of being blown out towards the end game if you're not able to develop your Bucky and Diablo draw engine early on while discarding the opponent's hand. Essentially, if you're going up against, let's say, Sapphire Steel or Sapphire Ruby or even Ruby Amethyst, if you get to the point in the game where they're able to drop higher end threats, things like Madame Medusas, Mauis, Tamatoas, Aerials, established Lucky Dimes, Maleficent Dragons even, the Steel Emerald packages will have a tough time outing that if you haven't been able to discard their hand. Furthermore, all of those decks that I mentioned, Sapphire Ruby, Sapphire Steel, Ruby Amethyst, even Ruby Amber, all have very strong draw engines that if you can't slow them down quick enough with the Bucky discard, or you see that a package a little too late, they're going to have better top end threats and more resources to work with than you likely will, and it'll be a struggle for you to close out the game potentially. Now that being said, Emerald Steel does have a decent mid-range game, but it's just not going to be strong enough to compete with the high toughness characters that these other decks are going to be able to throw down and quest for a lot during the end game. So the Emerald Steel deck, in my opinion, when it goes off, it's almost unbeatable, but if you don't see specific cards in specific scenarios, it can lead to a very slow start for you, and if your opponent just ends up gassing up with like a Hiram draw engine, you can't slow them down fast enough because they'll outdraw your discard when you eventually see it, and then you're just going to lose in the mid to end game anyways. And to finish off the tier list, we're going to be taking a look at Ruby Sapphire, which I've put into the D tier. No, I'm kidding. It's definitely an S tier deck. The deck that, in my opinion, got the most support from Ursula's return. I guess you could argue Emerald Steel also got a lot of support since the way that deck is played has really shifted. But Ruby Sapphire still has the biggest problem that it did from previous sets. in that it loses to itself because it plays such a high number of uninkables. So when you look at a tournament setting, do you really want to play a deck that, you know, you're not going to really lose to the matchup, you're mostly going to lose to yourself being not able to play because you have too many uninkables? I don't know, it's hard to say. Will we see versions of this deck that tailor back on those uninkables for the tournament setting in order to be more consistent? Because the ceiling for this deck and the power level definitely outclasses most other decks in the format. I think so. I think if you look at what deck will be the most successful out of all the different Ruby Sapphires that will be played, it will probably be a version that's on 20 or less uninkables. Again, I could be wrong. You could see a version with 26 uninkables do very well, but I think that that's a stretch. Again, just coming from the mindset of consistency is king, you definitely want to be able to play the game, and playing uninkables is not the way to go in that scenario. And that's why I kind of rate Sapphire Steel a little bit higher than Ruby Sapphire, despite Ruby Sapphire having the higher ceiling, the better top end, and again, just a more explosive board. The other issue that Ruby Sapphire has is that you definitely need to see your draw engine. You do play a number of scrying cards or consistency cards, right? Like Develop Your Brains, Grammatalas, How Far All Goes, which will help you get through your deck quickly to hopefully see those Hieroms. But that being said, your Hieroms are likely going to get outed right away, right? And so if the opposing player is able to generate better card advantage than you, I do think that the Ruby Sapphire deck will suffer in those scenarios. And if you don't see your Hierom engine at all, then I think you definitely just lose the game at that point. It's very tough to come back when you're not seeing a way to put more threats into your hand and keep a healthy hand. So those limitations, I think, still hold Ruby Sapphire back a little bit, but I definitely think it's an S tier deck because we've seen that it's still able to cut through the field fairly effectively. It has good matchups into pretty much the rest of the field potentially. It doesn't really have too many bad matchups anymore. That's one of the things that Ursula's Return solved for Ruby Sapphire, and its ability now to deal more effectively with aggro, both from a removal standpoint and potentially just keeping up with the lore gain thanks to things like the Flynn Rider Sisu package. So I do think that the Sapphire Steel and Sapphire Ruby are the clear front runners in Ursula's Return. Will be exciting to see if these decks are some of the top decks in the top cut. I would anticipate that between Sapphire Steel and Sapphire Ruby, they make up at least 4 decks in the top 8. We'll see if I'm wrong. I do think you see Ruby Amethyst. I think you see Emerald Steel. And this is kind of like a cop-out answer because this is more or less what the pack tournament was over that June 1st and 2nd weekend. I don't think Amber Steel or Amethyst Emerald do enough to make it into top 8 or top 4. I think there's a long shot for Amber Ruby to make it if there's enough people who are willing to try it, if they've practiced enough. But again, I think that it's still too much of a risky option for people to go in with. I think most people are going to stick to what they know to be an effective deck, which is going to be the Sapphire decks, Emerald Steel, and Ruby Amethyst. Anyways, that's going to do it for this video. If you enjoyed this content, please leave a like. It took me quite a while to record each clip individually to make sure that I was staying on point and not stuttering or anything. So any support on the video would help. Comment, let me know what you think. Thank you again for watching. Quantum is out.